A girl is kidnapped in the middle of a rainy Chicago night. Her rescuer turns out to be the city's most notorious mafia boss. But when he tries to take her home, she begs him not to. Because that house isn't a refuge. It's where she's been slowly dying for 24 years. This is the story of a violent man learning to protect, and a vulnerable woman learning to survive. If you're watching, please like and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has come. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, the kind of rain that didn't clean anything. It just moved the dirt around. Dante Voss stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his 42nd floor penthouse and watched Black Ridge City bleed beneath him. The streets below were slick and dark, headlights smearing against wet asphalt, the whole city looking like something half dissolved. He had a glass of bourbon in his left hand that he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. His right hand was pressed flat against the cold glass, fingers spread, and he was watching a single yellow cab try to navigate a flooded intersection 6 blocks north. It didn't make it. The cab stalled. The driver got out into the rain. Dante watched the man stand there in the downpour, hands on his head, staring at his dead vehicle like it had personally betrayed him. He knew the feeling. Mercer's attorneys filed the last of the paperwork this morning, said a voice behind him. Roman Vale set a manila folder on the dining table without being asked and poured himself a drink without being invited. He was like that, always moving through Dante's space like he owned a share of it. 6 years together had a way of doing that to people. Roman was the kind of man who was handsome in a sharp, angular way that made people trust him before he opened his mouth, which was dangerous because once he opened his mouth, the trust usually held anyway. He was good at that, good at making things feel settled when they weren't. Final? Dante asked, still watching the cab driver. Final. The Mercer Group is done. Everything liquidated, everything transferred. The estate goes to auction next Thursday. Roman paused. Gideon is in a care facility in Westport. Memory issues, apparently. Won't stand trial for anything. Won't stand trial, Dante repeated. He's not competent, legally. Dante finally turned from the window. He looked at the bourbon in his hand, considered it, and set it on the windowsill without drinking. And the daughter? Roman's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. Gone. She cleared out 2 months ago. Nobody's tracking her. I'm not asking you to track her. Then what are you asking? Dante didn't answer. He picked up the folder Roman had left and opened it, not because he needed to read it. He already knew every number, every clause, every demolished asset, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. The Mercer Group, 32 years of legacy, 47 subsidiary holdings, 3 generations of a family name that had meant something in this city once. Now it meant a Thursday auction and a man in a memory care facility who probably couldn't remember what he'd done to deserve it. But Dante remembered. He remembered exactly what Gideon Mercer had done. He just couldn't make himself feel what he'd expected to feel. That was the problem. He'd spent 7 years, building toward this. Every move he made, every alliance he forged, every deal he closed had been aimed at one target. The systematic, methodical dismantling of everything Gideon Mercer had built. And now it was done. And Dante was standing in a penthouse with 42 floors between him and the street, holding a folder full of proof that he'd won. And the feeling in his chest was something closer to an empty room than a celebration. He closed the folder, set it down. What's on the books for this week? He asked. Roman sat, crossing one leg over the other, his drink balanced on his knee. Pier 9 shipment comes in Wednesday. Harlan's crew is handling the offload. I want to move the East Side territories to consolidated control before end of month. That means meetings with the Vasquez operation and with the Koreans. The Koreans are going to be a problem. They're always a problem. That's why we manage them instead of trust them. Roman smiled. It reached his eyes. It always reached his eyes. After that, there's the matter of the councilman. He's been late 3 payments running. He needs a reminder. Send Calder. Calder's too aggressive. That's why I said send Calder. Roman nodded, making a note in the small leather notebook he carried everywhere. Dante had always found that notebook slightly unsettling, not because of what might be in it, but because Roman was the only person in his organization who wrote things down. Everyone else operated on spoken word, on the understanding that paper was liability. Roman insisted the notebook was coded, personal, meaningless to anyone but himself. Dante had never pushed it. Maybe he should have. "Get some sleep," Roman said, standing. "You look like you haven't in 3 days." "I haven't." "Then sleep. The Empire doesn't require your insomnia to function." He paused at the door. "The Mercer thing is done, Dante. Let it be done." Dante didn't respond. Roman left. The door closed with a soft, expensive click, and Dante was alone again with the rain and the bourbon. He wasn't drinking and the hollow feeling he didn't know what to do with. He picked up the bourbon, finally drank it. It didn't help. He'd been 17 when his father died. The official story was cardiac arrest. A man in his mid-50s, overworked, under pressure, heart gave out one Tuesday morning in his office. That was what the death certificate said. That was what the newspaper mentioned in a 3-paragraph item on page 8 of the business section. What the newspaper didn't mention was that Marco Voss had been in the middle of exposing Gideon Mercer's financial fraud operation when he died. What it didn't mention was that Marco had been healthy, running 3 miles a day, seeing his cardiologist annually, no history of heart disease. What it didn't mention was that 2 of the 3 witnesses to Marco's collapse had since disappeared, and the 3rd had moved to another country with no forwarding address. Dante had been a 17-year-old kid in a school blazer sitting in the back of a black car at his father's funeral, watching men in expensive suits shake hands over a casket, and something had hardened inside him like concrete setting. It wasn't grief exactly. Grief was too soft a word for it. It was more like a decision. He'd spent the next 12 years making himself into something capable of acting on that decision. By 29, he ran Blackridge's most powerful criminal organization. Not through inheritance, not through connection, but through sheer methodical accumulation of power, deal by deal, threat by threat, until the city's underworld understood that Dante Voss wasn't someone you worked around. He was someone you worked for, or someone you feared, and the distinction was mostly academic. He had targeted Gideon Mercer the way a surgeon targets a tumor, precisely, completely, without hesitation. He'd corrupted Mercer's business partners, engineered the collapse of his real estate holdings, blackmailed his associates into silence, and dismantled his financial network piece by piece over 4 years until there was nothing left. He had also, along the way, destroyed Celine Mercer. That part he'd done deliberately. Celine had been the heir to everything Gideon built, trained from childhood to run the empire, sharp and capable, and by all accounts entirely innocent of her father's crimes. Dante had known that. He'd destroyed her anyway. It was cleaner to take everything. It was more complete. It made the message undeniable. He'd planted fraudulent financial documents that had ended her career as a corporate attorney. He'd arranged for a competitor to acquire the charity she ran using Mercer money. He'd orchestrated the margin calls that wiped out her personal investments along with the family's. He'd taken everything, the way Gideon Mercer had taken everything from Marco Voss, and he told himself that was justice. Standing at the window in the rain 7 years later, Dante was less certain what it was. But he found the ambush on a Wednesday, or rather, the ambush found him. He'd gone to the Pier 9 operation personally, not standard practice, but Harlan had flagged irregularities in the shipment manifest that he wanted eyes on, and Dante had wanted the air. The docks at night had a smell he'd always liked, diesel and salt water and cold metal, and sometimes moving through space helped him think when standing still didn't. He'd taken 2 men with him, Calder and a newer soldier named Price, who'd been recommended by Roman and who'd been solid in the 6 months since. They were 40 yards from the warehouse when the shooting started. It wasn't a warning shot. It wasn't a negotiation. Whoever had set it up wasn't interested in talking. The fire came from 3 points simultaneously, coordinated, and the 2 men with Dante went down in the first 4 seconds. He felt the round catch him across the left side before he fully registered that he was moving, muscle memory carrying him into the shadow between shipping containers while his brain was still processing the fact that his people were dead. He ran. He'd spent his entire adult life being the person other people ran from. He ran now without pride, without hesitation, because pride was a luxury that died when the shooting started. And he was hit, and he didn't know how badly yet, and the priority was distance. He moved through the container yard in the dark, using the sound of rain on metal to cover his footsteps, cutting left when instinct told him to, right when the sound of pursuit shifted. They weren't close enough. Either they were amateurs with good intelligence, or they were professionals who'd expected him to go down in the first volley and hadn't planned well for the alternative. He made it 6 blocks before his legs started to fail him. The building he found was abandoned, an old textile factory that had been scheduled for demolition 3 times and survived all 3 schedules through bureaucratic inertia. He got through a broken ground floor window and got himself into a corner behind a collapsed section of shelving and pressed his hand against his side and took stock. Through. The round had gone through, which was the good news. The bad news was that the exit wound was larger than the entrance wound, which they always were, and the blood loss was significant enough that his hands were already shaking. He'd seen men survive worse. He'd seen men die from less. The determining factor was almost always time and pressure, and he had his jacket balled against the wound and approximately no access to anything else useful. He was going to have to call for help. The question was who. His phone had cracked at some point. The screen was fractured across one corner, but it still worked. He opened his contacts and stared at them. Roman. His first instinct was Roman. His first instinct was wrong. Some part of him understood, though he couldn't have articulated why. Not yet. He tried 2 other numbers. Both went to voicemail. He was still deciding what to do when he heard footsteps. Not pursuit footsteps. No urgency. No tactical spacing. Single set. Light. Someone moving through the building who wasn't expecting to find anything. He didn't have the strength to get the gun up in time. He just watched the flashlight beam move across the ceiling and waited. The light found him. The woman who held it stopped. She was somewhere in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a jacket with a small embroidered logo on the breast that his vision was too blurred to read, carrying a bag that looked medical. She stared at him. He stared back. The flashlight stayed on his face, and he could see enough of her expression to read the shock in it, and then the recognition, and then something much harder than either of those things. He knew her face. He hadn't seen it in 5 years, but he knew it. He'd spent enough time studying the person he planned to destroy to know exactly what Celine Mercer looked like. She looked different now. Not worse. Different. The smoothness he remembered from photographs had been replaced by something more angular, more settled. She looked like a person who had survived something and come out the other side of it with a clearer understanding of what she was made of. She looked at him bleeding on the floor of an abandoned factory and didn't say a word for a long moment. Then she said, "You've got maybe 40 minutes. Before what? Before that becomes unfixable." She nodded at his side. "Maybe less." Dante watched her face. "You know who I am." "Yes." "Then you know what I did." "Yes." She set the bag down, crouched, opened it. "I know exactly what you did." "Then why?" "Because I'm not you." She pulled on a pair of gloves with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this many times. "Don't talk. It makes the bleeding worse." He wanted to argue. He was in the habit of arguing, of filling every silence with something that established his position in it. Instead, he found himself watching her hands move over the wound with a competence that surprised him. Not because he'd underestimated her exactly, but because he'd never had to think about what she'd become after he'd taken everything from her. He'd never thought about that at all. "You work medical?" he managed. "I run a clinic." Her jaw was tight. "The neighborhood you're currently bleeding in, actually. 3 blocks north. We do free care for people who can't afford anything else." She didn't look at his face while she worked. "Some nights I do outreach, walk the buildings, find people who are hurt or sick and won't come in on their own." "You found me by accident." "If it wasn't an accident, you'd already be dead." That was a fair point. He didn't have a response to it. He lay back against the cold concrete wall and let her work and tried to think clearly through the blood loss and the adrenaline crash and the fact that the woman he'd systematically destroyed was keeping him alive with her bare hands. She worked in near silence for 20 minutes. She packed the wound with something that burned and then with something that didn't. She got an IV line into his arm from a bag she produced from the bottom of the medical kit. And he didn't ask what was in it because his ability to have opinions about medical treatment had largely expired. At some point, she sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time. "You need a hospital," she said. "I can't go to a hospital." "I know." She pulled off one glove. "That's why I said you need one, not that you were going to one. Can you— My clinic doesn't have what you need for this, but I know someone who works out of a private facility in the garment district. He doesn't ask questions." She paused. "He's going to want money. Money's not a problem." "Okay." She stood, started repacking the bag. "I'm going to call him. Then I'm going to call a car." "Why are you doing this?" She stopped, didn't turn around immediately. When she did turn, her expression was controlled in a way that told him exactly how much control she was exerting. "I spent a long time being angry at you," she said. "I spent a long time imagining this exact scenario. You helpless, in pain, needing something that only I could give." Her voice was flat. Not cold exactly, just flat. "I spent a long time being sure that when this moment came, if it ever came, I would walk away. And I'm still here." She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, which felt like longer. "I don't know what that means yet. Don't make me figure it out tonight." She turned back to her phone, started dialing. Dante sat in the blood on the concrete floor of the abandoned factory and watched the woman he'd broken make a call to save his life. And he felt something shift inside him. Not redemption, nothing that clean. Just the first hairline crack in 7 years of certainty. Outside, the rain kept falling. His phone buzzed against the floor. Screen lit. A message from Roman. "Where are you? Heard about the pier. Talk to me." Dante looked at the message for a long moment. He didn't respond. Something about the timing of it, the way Roman had heard, the speed with which the text arrived, scraped against the inside of his skull. But he was bleeding and cold, and the thought dissolved before he could grip it. He didn't know yet that Roman already knew exactly where he was. He didn't know yet that Roman had known about the pier before it happened. He didn't know yet that everything he'd believed about his father's death, about the 7 years that had followed it, about every move he'd made and every life he'd destroyed, all of it was built on a story that Roman Vale had written. He found that out later. Right now, he lay on a factory floor in the Rain District of Black Ridge City, watching a woman he had no right to ask anything of make a call to save his life, and tried to remember how to breathe. The car came 40 minutes later. Celine rode with him. She didn't explain why. He didn't ask. She sat across from him in the back of the vehicle with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window, and neither of them said anything for the first 10 minutes. The city moved past in streaks of wet light. Dante kept one hand pressed against the packed wound and focused on keeping his breathing even, and tried not to think about the fact that his entire organization had gone silent in the last hour. No calls, no check-ins, none of the constant ambient noise of an empire in motion. He tried not to think about what that silence meant. "You still hate me," he said. Not a question. She took a moment. "Yes." "But you're here. I already told you I don't know what that means." "You said don't make you figure it out tonight." "That's what I said." The car stopped at a red light. A group of people were sheltering under the awning of a closed restaurant across the street, waiting out the rain, laughing about something. Regular people. People whose biggest problem tonight was wet shoes. Dante watched them until the light changed. "The clinic," he said. "Is it yours? You built it yourself?" The question seemed to surprise her. Not the sentiment, the fact that he was asking it. "Yes," she said after a pause. After everything. Her voice didn't change. "I had to do something. I know that area. I knew the people who needed help there. So," she stopped. Started again. "It wasn't altruism. It was the only thing I could think of that made the days worth finishing." Dante didn't say anything. "You look surprised," she said. "I thought—" He stopped. "You thought I'd be destroyed." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Celine turned back to the window. "You almost were right," she said quietly. "There were 6 months where you were completely right." She said it without drama, without anger, just factually, the way someone reports the weather. "And then I decided not to be, that's all. There wasn't a moment. There wasn't an epiphany. I just decided one morning that the story wasn't finished and started writing the next part. The car pulled up to an unmarked building in the garment district. A man in a gray coat was waiting at the service entrance. Celine got out first and spoke to the man for 30 seconds. Then she came back and helped Dante out of the car. He accepted the help with less resistance than he would have expected from himself, which told him how much blood he'd lost. As they moved toward the entrance, she kept her hand at his back, not supporting his weight exactly, just there. Present. He would think about that later. The way she didn't pull back from contact with a man she had every reason to hate. The discipline of it. Or maybe not discipline. Maybe something else. He didn't have a word for it. At the door, he stopped. "If you'd walked away tonight," he said, "at the factory. If you'd left me there." "I know," she said. "No one would have blamed you." "I know that too." She pushed the door open. "Come on, you're losing color." He went through the door. Somewhere across the city, in a building Dante didn't know about yet, Roman Vale sat at a desk and looked at the map of safe houses he'd just confirmed, and crossed off the ones that were already compromised, and counted the ones that weren't, and picked up his phone to make the calls that would end everything Dante had built. He was smiling when he did it, the kind of smile that had always reached his eyes. The doctor's name was Heirs, and he worked without speaking. That suited Dante fine. He lay on a steel examination table in a room that smelled like antiseptic and old paint and listened to the sounds of a city that had no idea what was happening inside it. Heirs was in his 60s, Eastern European by accent on the 3 words he'd said since they arrived, with hands that were completely steady and eyes that stayed on the work and never came up to check Dante's face. A professional. The kind of professional who'd made a calculation long ago that the money was better on the unofficial side of medicine, and who'd made peace with that calculation. Celine sat in a chair in the corner. She hadn't left. Dante noticed that. He didn't comment on it. He stared at the water-stained ceiling and counted the cracks in the plaster and breathed through the needlework and thought about the silence coming from his phone. Still nothing. No calls. No messages except Roman's single text, which sat in his inbox like a stone. Heirs finished with the wound at 11:47. He said the bullet had missed everything it needed to miss. He said the blood loss was significant but manageable. He said Dante needed to stay still for 48 hours minimum, and that moving before then was his own problem. Then he named a number. Dante transferred it from his phone without negotiating. Heirs didn't react to that either. Just pocketed his own phone, stripped his gloves, and left the room. The door closed. Celine didn't move from the chair. "You should go," Dante said. "Probably. I mean it. Whatever's happening tonight, you don't want to be attached to it." She looked at him directly for the first time since the car. "I'm already attached to it. I pulled a bullet wound dressing on a crime lord in an abandoned building. That ship has sailed. Then go before it gets worse." "Is it going to get worse?" He didn't answer. She read the non-answer correctly. "Tell me what happened at the pier," she said. "That's not your concern. You're in my city. I just spent 2 hours keeping you alive." Her voice didn't rise. It just got more precise, the way a blade gets more dangerous the thinner you grind it. "It is absolutely my concern." Dante looked at the ceiling. The longest crack ran from the light fixture to the northeast corner and branched into 3 smaller cracks near the wall. He followed it the way you follow a river on a map, tracing the tributaries. "Someone set up the ambush," he said. "Someone inside your organization. Has to be. The timing, the positioning, they knew my schedule. They knew which men I'd have with me." He paused. "Calder and Price are dead." She absorbed that without visible reaction. "And you think it's your second in command?" He turned his head to look at her. "I didn't say that." "You didn't respond to his text." The observation landed. Dante held her gaze. She was watching him with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor hostile, just attentive, the way someone watches a situation they're trying to understand before they decide what to do about it. "You're sharper than I expected," he said. "You expected someone broken." "I expected someone angry." "I'm both," she said. "Sharp and angry aren't mutually exclusive." She stood, moved to the window, looked out at the alley below. If it's your second, then your safe houses are compromised. Your accounts might be compromised. Anyone who reports to him directly is a question mark. I know. Where are you going to go? I don't know yet. You need somewhere they won't look. She said it to the window, not to him. Her breath fogged the glass slightly. Somewhere off your map entirely. The silence between them was different from the silences earlier. Earlier there'd been history in it. Weight, accusation, the pressure of everything unsaid. This one was more functional. Two people thinking through the same problem from different angles. You're not offering, he said. I haven't decided yet. But you're considering it. She turned from the window. Her expression was difficult to read, which meant she was working to make it difficult to read. What I'm considering, she said carefully, is that you show up bleeding in a building 3 blocks from my clinic, which means that whatever is about to come apart, it's going to come apart in my neighborhood. And I have patients there. I have staff. I have people who depend on that clinic continuing to function. She crossed her arms. So my interest in your situation is not personal. It is entirely geographic and logistical. Of course, he said. Don't do that. Do what? That tone. That... She stopped. Reset. I'm not doing this to help you. I want to be very clear about that. You've been very clear. I'm helping myself and the people in that neighborhood. Understood. She stared at him for a moment. You're the most aggravating person I've ever dealt with, and I grew up around criminal defense attorneys. Despite everything, the blood loss, the cold, the hollow drumming of bad possibilities in his skull, Dante almost smiled. He controlled it. It was a near thing. My apartment, she said finally, the words coming out like she was paying for them. It's a 15-minute drive. It's not registered to anything connected to you. Nobody who works for you or against you has any reason to know it exists. She held up one finger. 48 hours. That's what Feher said. After that, you figure out your own geography. 48 hours, he agreed. And you tell me what's happening, all of it, because if something violent is going to land on my doorstep, I want to know it's coming. He looked at her steadily. That might be more than you want to hear. I'll be the judge of that. The apartment was on the 6th floor of a building that overlooked the industrial waterfront. It was small and spare and almost aggressively functional. A couch, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, bookshelves that were actually used, a desk near the window covered in patient intake files and medical supply invoices. No decoration except a single photograph on the kitchen wall that Dante didn't look at long enough to identify. She put him on the couch with a pillow and a blanket that smelled like cedar and told him not to move and disappeared into the kitchen. He heard water running and the sounds of cabinet doors. He used the time to call 3 numbers. The first 2 didn't pick up. Men he'd trusted with mid-level operations, men who would normally answer on the second ring. The silence coming back through the phone was the same quality of silence as the absence of messages. Specific, pointed, meaning something. The 3rd number picked up on the 5th ring. Dante. The voice was Mira Santo, who ran his financial operations from a quiet office in the financial district and who was either the most honest person in his organization or the best actress. I've been trying to reach you. What's happening? A pause. He could hear her breathing, hear something that might have been her moving across a room. 2 hours ago, I got remote commands to initiate transfers out of 3 of the reserve accounts. Looked like your authentication. I flagged them and called for confirmation and nobody answered. How much? 60% of liquid reserves. I stopped it. But whoever sent the commands has your authentication credentials, Dante. That's not something I should even be saying on a phone. Did you trace the originating terminal? Already working on it. I'll have something by morning. Another pause. There's something else. Harlan's crew. I've been trying to reach them about the peer discrepancy and I'm getting nothing, not voicemail, just nothing. Harlan's dead, Dante said. The silence on her end was different from the other silences. How many tonight? At least 3 that I know of. He heard her exhale. It was shaky at the edges, which told him she was scared, which meant she wasn't in on it, or she was too good to be rattled, and that was the performance. He decided to believe the fear was real. He needed to believe something was real. Keep your head down, he said. Don't go to the office. Don't contact anyone in the organization except through the secondary channels. And don't, he stopped, reconsidered. Don't contact Roman. The silence that followed that statement was the most informative silence of the night. Okay, Mira said quietly. Just that. He ended the call. Celine came out of the kitchen with a bowl of something that was hot enough to steam and a glass of water and set both on the coffee table without commentary. He noticed her hands weren't steady, not visibly shaking, but not the rock-solid hands she'd had in the factory and at heirs. The adrenaline from earlier was metabolizing, and whatever she was actually feeling about the situation was starting to bleed through the control. He noticed and didn't mention it. Eat, she said. I need to tell you something first. She sat in the chair across from him and waited. The organization is compromised. Accounts, safe houses, crews. I don't know the full scope yet, but it's significant. He watched her face. Whoever is moving against me has been building this for a long time. This isn't opportunistic. It's structured. You're second. Almost certainly. How long has he been with you? 6 years. She absorbed that. And before tonight, any signs? Dante thought about the leather notebook, about the way Roman moved through his space, about 6 years of absolute reliability, 6 years of competence and loyalty, and the horrible thing about that reliability was that it had been real. The competence was real, the execution was real. It was only the direction of it that had apparently been other than advertised. Nothing I caught, he said. That's the answer, and it's the most honest thing I can tell you about the last 6 years. Celine was quiet for a moment. Why did you target my father? The question landed sideways. Not because it was unexpected. It was the obvious question, eventually. But because of the timing, the directness. You know why. I know the reason you believed. I want to hear you say it. He met her eyes. I believed your father was responsible for my father's death. Believed, she repeated, past tense. The timeline is wrong, he said slowly. It had been sitting at the back of his mind for 3 weeks, a splinter he hadn't been able to reach. He'd found discrepancies in the documents, dates that didn't align, a signature on a key memo that the handwriting analysis couldn't firmly attribute. He'd been picking at it without knowing what he was picking at. There are things in the record that don't fit the story I was told. Who told you the story? He didn't answer immediately. Celine leaned forward in her chair. Who, specifically, brought you the evidence that my father ordered your father's death? The answer sat in his chest like a stone in water. Roman, he said. The word fell into the room and just stayed there. Celine sat back. She put one hand over her mouth briefly, then lowered it. Her eyes were doing something complicated. So the man who's been dismantling your organization from the inside is the same man who handed me the reason to build it in a particular direction. Dante's voice was level. He was keeping it level through effort that was costing him something he could feel. Yes. That's... She stopped, started again. How long have you known? I haven't known. I've suspected something was wrong with the evidence for 3 weeks. Tonight is the first time the pieces... He stopped. Tonight is the first time they've landed in the right order. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, rain hit the windows in irregular gusts. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Normal sounds, the sounds of a world still operating on its previous assumptions. My father didn't kill your father, she said. I don't know that yet. But the evidence I was given? I don't trust it. Not anymore. My father was a lot of things. Her jaw was tight. He was not a murderer. He cut corners, he played rough in business, but she pressed her lips together. He was not that. I know, Dante said. It was the worst 2 words he'd said in 7 years. The simplest and the worst. Celine stood abruptly and walked to the window. He watched her back, the set of her shoulders, the way she put one hand on the glass, the same way he'd stood at his own window 3 days ago, looking at the city below. Parallel gestures. 2 people trying to find something solid. You destroyed everything, she said to the glass. My career. My family's money. The estate. My father's reputation. She wasn't raising her voice. That almost made it worse. I spent 6 months thinking I wasn't going to be able to. She stopped, breathed. 6 months. I know. Don't keep saying that. I don't have anything better to say. No. She turned. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible in every muscle of her face. You don't. You really don't. The silence after that was heavy enough to push against. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. Text message. Peer job was only the introduction. By morning, you'll understand the scope. Come in, and we negotiate. Run, and we expedite. R. He turned the phone so she could read it from where she stood. She read it. Her expression didn't change. He wants to negotiate. He wants me to believe he wants to negotiate. What does he actually want? To make sure I'm running scared so I don't have time to think clearly before he finishes the job. Dante set the phone down. It's what I would do. She stared at him. That's a deeply unsettling thing to say. It's useful to know what you're dealing with. She came back to the chair, sat, looked at him with an expression that was cycling through several things too quickly to catch all of them. What are you going to do? I'm going to spend the next 48 hours figuring out what's left, what I can count on, what he's already taken. He paused. And I'm going to find out the truth about my father. And then I'm going to end this. She held his gaze for a long moment. You can't use my apartment as a staging ground for criminal operations. I know. I mean it. I know. I have patients. I have staff who come to the clinic 3 blocks away. If anything, nothing comes here, he said. I give you my word. She made a sound that was very close to a short, bitter laugh. Your word. He didn't argue with that. He didn't have standing to argue with it. She stood again, more slowly this time. The bedroom is mine. The couch is yours. There's a lock on the bathroom door, and I suggest you remember that it exists. She moved toward the hallway. Don't touch my files. I won't. She stopped in the doorway, didn't turn around. For what it's worth, she said, and her voice was quieter now, stripped of the precision she'd been maintaining. I don't think you did it because you were cruel. I think you did it because you were 17 years old and you lost your father and someone handed you a story and you believed it. She paused. That doesn't make it okay. But it's the truth as I understand it. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure there was anything to say. Good night, Dante. She went down the hallway. He heard the bedroom door close. Not slammed, just closed, firmly, with the particular finality of someone who'd decided the conversation was done. He lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling of her apartment and listened to the rain and felt the wound in his side and thought about Roman Vale sitting somewhere in this city, smiling with eyes that reached, working through a plan that had apparently been years in the making. At 2:14 in the morning, his phone lit up with a message from Mira. He read it twice. Then he sat up, slowly, pulling against the pane, and read it a third time to make sure he had it right. Trace the authentication terminal. Commands originated from Roman's private office. But Dante, there's more. I found a secondary file buried in the reserve account access logs. Payment records. Historical. Going back 8 years, monthly transfers to a private account. The receiving account traces to a holding company. A pause in the message, visible in the timestamp gap. The holding company is registered to someone named Marcus Hale. I ran the name. Marcus Hale is a former associate of a man named Conrad Voss. Dante stopped breathing for a moment. Conrad Voss. His uncle. His father's younger brother, who had been excluded from Marco Voss's will, who had disputed it, who had lost the dispute, and who had disappeared from Dante's life when Dante was 19, and whom he hadn't thought about in a decade. The transfers start 8 years before your father died, Mira's message continued. They stopped the month after. I think Roman wasn't working alone on the original setup. I think someone hired him to do it. Someone who had reason to want your father gone and then reason to point you at the Mercers. His phone screen blurred at the edges, and it took him a second to understand that his hands were shaking. Not from blood loss. He looked at the hallway, the strip of darkness under Celine's door, the woman he'd spent 7 years destroying, the collateral damage of a revenge that had been designed, engineered from the beginning to destroy the wrong person. He thought about calling Mira back. He thought about Roman's text, the easy arrogance of it, the assumption that Dante was already running. He thought about his father's face, which he could still see clearly if he tried, not the way most memories faded, because he'd never let that one fade. He'd kept it sharp on purpose, used it like a blade. His father laughing at something on the kitchen radio. His father reading at the dining room table with his glasses pushed up on his forehead. His father at the funeral of a colleague, standing very straight, not crying, because Marco Voss had believed that grief was private. His father, who had been murdered by a plan that Roman Vale had designed, and that Dante had spent his entire adult life executing on Roman's behalf without knowing it. He put the phone down. He put his hands over his face. Outside, the rain shifted. Heavier now, the kind of rain that meant the storm wasn't passing, it was settling in. The windows shook slightly in their frames. The waterfront lights blurred through the glass into shapeless color. Down the hallway, behind a closed door, Celine Mercer was either sleeping or lying awake in the dark. And Dante understood with a clarity that felt like something physical, like the bullet wound, a specific located pain, that when morning came, he was going to have to walk down that hallway and say words to her that he had never said to anyone. Not because it would fix anything, not because she'd accept them, but because she deserved to hear them, and he had run out of reasons to keep being the man who didn't say hard things. The empire was gone. The revenge was a lie. The 6 years of Roman Vale were a slow-burning fuse that had just reached the charge. There was no version of tomorrow that looked like yesterday. He dropped his hands, looked at the ceiling, breathed. And somewhere across the city, Roman Vale picked up a phone and began making the calls that would strip away every last resource Dante Voss had left. Every safe house, every account, every soldier who hadn't already flipped. Because Roman had been patient for 8 years, and patience, in his experience, always paid. He was almost finished. He just needed Dante to stay. He lay on Celine's couch in the dark and stared at the ceiling and let the information from Mira's message work through him the way cold works through wet clothing. Slowly, completely, until there was no part of him that wasn't touched by it. Conrad Voss, his father's brother. The man who had sat at Marco's funeral with dry eyes and a hand on Dante's shoulder and said, "Your father would be proud of you, son," in a voice that had felt, at 17, like the only solid thing left in the world. The man who had then spent the next 8 years funding Roman Vale's patient infiltration of Dante's life. Dante thought about the first time Roman had come to him. 22 years old, Dante had been running mid-level operations in the Blackridge docks with more ambition than infrastructure, still building, still consolidating. Roman had walked into a meeting through a connection that Dante now understood had been engineered, the right introduction at the right moment, the kind of coincidence that only looks like coincidence if you're not watching for the architecture behind it. Roman had come with competence and loyalty, and 6 months in, with the evidence. The file. Photographs, financial records, a deposition from a source that Roman had vouched for personally, all pointing to Gideon Mercer as the man who had arranged Marco Voss's death to protect his own financial fraud operation. Dante had spent 3 weeks checking it independently, or what he'd believed was independently, not understanding yet that Roman had built the verification trails as carefully as he'd built the original file. He had believed it because he'd needed to believe something. That was the part that lived in his chest now, like broken glass. He'd been handed a story, and he had chosen it, fed it, built an empire in its service, and spent 7 years destroying a family that had nothing to do with his father's death. And the man who'd put the weapon in his hand was currently in the process of taking everything Dante had built and absorbing it into his own operation. At 4 a.m, he got up. Moving hurt. The wound was a deep, specific ache that sharpened into something more pointed when he bent wrong, and he moved carefully, one hand on the wall of the hallway, navigating by the ambient light coming through the windows. He found the kitchen by memory and ran cold water over his hands and stood at the sink and looked at his own face in the dark window glass above it. He looked like what he was, a man who'd made a catastrophic mistake and was now standing in the wreckage of it with a bullet wound and 48 hours before his body would let him do anything useful. He heard the bedroom door open. Celine appeared in the hallway, barefoot, in dark clothes, hair loose. She'd clearly been awake. There was no sleep fog in her eyes, no adjustment period, just direct attention focused immediately at him. "You should be still," she said. "I know." "Are you in pain?" "Yes." She came into the kitchen, moved past him with the efficiency of someone accustomed to a small space, and opened a cabinet and produced a prescription bottle. She shook 2 tablets into her palm and held them out. He took them without asking what they were, which she noted with a slight tightening around her eyes but didn't comment on. He took the water she offered, took the pills, set the glass down. "Tell me about your uncle," she said. He looked at her sharply. "You've been in there not sleeping for 3 hours, she said, gesturing at the couch. "Whatever Mira sent you changed your face. I saw it before I went to bed." She crossed her arms, not defensively, just settled. "Tell me." So he told her. He kept it flat, factual, the way you report damage after a storm. Here is what was lost. Here is what remains. Conrad Voss, the disputed will, the 8-year payment trail, the holding company, Roman's recruitment, the file about Gideon, all of it laid out in the kitchen at 4 in the morning with the rain still going and the waterfront lights making pale shapes on the ceiling. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for almost a full minute. "Your uncle hired Roman to kill your father," she said, "to have him killed. I doubt Roman did it personally. And then Roman came to you with a false trail. Redirected me at your family, yes." She exhaled through her nose, slow, controlled. "So for 6 years, Roman had you running an operation that was eliminating his competition and building infrastructure he planned to eventually take. And keeping me focused on the Mercers instead of looking at him. Yes. That's..." She stopped. "That's not impulsive. That's not opportunistic. That's years of patience." "Roman is very patient," Dante said. "It was one of the things I valued about him." The bitterness in his own voice surprised him. He hadn't intended it to surface. Celine looked at him with an expression he couldn't classify. Not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that acknowledged the specific quality of this particular kind of betrayal without softening it. "What do you need to do?" she asked. "I need to find my uncle." You think he's still in contact with Roman?" "I think he's the only leverage I have. Roman wants the Empire, so he doesn't need Conrad anymore, which means Conrad's position is precarious. If I find Conrad before Roman decides to clean house..." He stopped. The thought completed itself in the silence. "You need to move before morning," she said. "I need to move now." Behair said 48 hours. Behair doesn't know my timeline. She looked at him steadily. "You tear that wound open, and you're not going to make it to your uncle or Roman or anyone else." "I know the risk." "Do you?" It wasn't a question. She said it the way you say something to someone who is being functionally stupid about their own body. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who's been operating on adrenaline and determination for 6 hours and is about to make a decision that ends with him bleeding out in a cab. I've functioned in worse condition. That's not the reassurance you think it is." He didn't have an answer to that. She was right, and he knew she was right, and knowing it didn't change the weight of the clock. 4 hours, she said. "Lie down for 4 hours. I'll monitor the wound. At 7, we reassess." She held his gaze. 4 hours isn't the difference between winning and losing, but it might be the difference between being functional and being a liability to yourself. He looked at her for a moment. "Why do you care if I'm functional?" "I already told you I don't." "Then why..." 4 hours, Dante." He went back to the couch. He didn't sleep, but he stayed still, which was almost the same thing. He heard her in the kitchen for a while, then silence, then the faint sound of movement in the bedroom. The building made its small sounds. The rain kept its own rhythm. At 6:47, his phone rang. Unknown number, not a text this time, an actual call. He answered. "You didn't respond to my message." Roman's voice was exactly what it always was, measured, slightly warm, the voice of a man who was perpetually 2 steps ahead and relaxed about it. "I'm choosing to interpret that as indecision rather than defiance." Dante said nothing. "The accounts are locked," Roman continued. "All of them. Mira is smart. She caught the first push, But I have her building access now, so that's only delaying the inevitable. By noon, the liquid reserves move. By end of day, the East Side territories formally transfer. A pause. This can be simple, Dante. Come in, sign the organizational documents, and I'll ensure you have an exit that doesn't involve a body bag. You've done good work. I'm not sentimental about it, but I'm not cruel either. You had my father killed. The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long. When Roman spoke again, his voice had changed by a small but measurable degree. Less warmth, more precision, like an instrument recalibrated. Conrad told you, he said. Conrad's records told me. Ah. A sound that might have been appreciation. Mira is very good. I've been meaning to recruit her properly. Another pause. Your father was going to expose a financial operation that several people had significant investment in. It was a business decision. I understand that's not how it feels from your perspective. He was my father. He was also a man who made enemies, as do we all. Roman's tone was still reasonable, which was the most infuriating quality it possessed. I gave you a purpose, Dante. I gave you a direction for something that would have consumed you anyway. You built something remarkable. The fact that it served my interests as well doesn't diminish what you accomplished. You used me to build an empire you intended to take. Yes. The simple confirmation of it, stated without apology or decoration, landed with more force than any denial would have. And Celine Mercer, Dante said, her family? Collateral. You chose that target, not me. I gave you Gideon's name. What you did with it was yours. Dante's grip on the phone tightened until he could feel the case flex. He made himself loosen it. He needed to think, not feel. Feeling was a luxury he'd schedule later. Where's Conrad? He asked. Safe. A pause. For now, that's negotiable depending on the choices you make in the next few hours. You're threatening my uncle. I'm clarifying the variables. Roman let that sit for a moment. Come in by noon, Dante. After noon, the variables change. The call ended. Dante sat with the dead phone in his hand. The light outside the windows was starting to shift. Not dawn exactly, but the first suggestion that dawn was being considered. The waterfront was coming into gray focus. A cargo ship was moving on the water, slow and enormous, its lights blurring in the residual rain. Celine was standing in the hallway. She'd heard enough. He has your uncle, she said. He has leverage that he's calling my uncle, yes. There's a difference. Conrad made his choices 8 years ago. Whatever Roman is using him for now is a consequence of those choices. His voice was even. He was working to keep it even. But I need to know where they are. She came into the room, sat in the chair. She'd pulled her hair back. She was watching him with the same attentive quality she'd had since the factory, reading him, cataloging, making assessments she wasn't sharing in full. Your organization is gone, she said. Most of it. Your money is going by noon. Mira may be able to delay it. And Roman has a man who can confirm the story about your father. She paused. Conrad can testify. To Roman's arrangement, to your father's death, to everything. If I can get to him. If Roman lets him live long enough. She leaned forward. Dante, you have no soldiers, no money, a wound that hasn't closed properly, in 6 hours. She said it not to discourage him, but to establish the actual dimensions of the problem. What do you have? He thought about it, genuinely thought, which took a moment. Mira, he said. She's clean and she's capable and she's scared, which means she's motivated. I have her. He paused. I have information Roman doesn't know I have, the secondary payment records, the holding company trace. That's leverage if I can get it in front of the right people. Another pause. And I have the fact that Roman expects me to be running scared, which means he's not fully accounting for forward movement. Celine was quiet for a moment. And me? She said. What do you have there? The question was careful, precisely calibrated. She wasn't offering anything. She was asking him to state what he thought the situation was. I don't know, he said honestly. She nodded, very slightly. Okay. She stood. I'm going to call in late to the clinic. Then I'm going to help you contact Mira because you need to do it through a clean channel, and mine is cleaner than anything you have left. She moved toward the kitchen. After that, we're going to figure out where Roman would hold a liability. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She stopped without turning. My father is in a care facility. He doesn't know what year it is half the time. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that had mass and weight. He spent the last years of his functional life watching everything he built get taken apart piece by piece. He thought he understood why. He thought he'd made enemies in business, and they'd come for him. She turned then. He didn't know it was engineered. He didn't know the man who ruined him was acting on a lie. A beat. I want him to know the truth before he can't understand anything anymore. Roman Vale has the person who can confirm that truth. So, she held Dante's gaze. Yes, I'm going to help. He didn't say thank you. It would have been wrong. Too small for what she was offering. Too presumptuous of a debt structure that didn't fit the situation. He just nodded. She went to make coffee and calls. He sat with the growing light and tried to build a plan out of almost nothing. Mira arrived at 9. She came through the building's service entrance, which Celine had arranged, and she came alone, which Dante had specified, and she looked like someone who had not slept and was managing the fear by converting it directly into focus. She was 41, compact, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of stillness that usually meant someone was doing significant internal processing. She set a laptop on Celine's kitchen table and opened it without preamble. The transfers are queued, she said. I've put up 3 layers of delay, but they're workarounds, not blocks. He has someone who knows the system. Who? Based on the access pattern, it's someone who used to work for me. She kept her eyes on the screen. A man named Dove. He left the operation 14 months ago, I thought voluntarily. Recruited. 14 months ago. She said it with a particular flatness that meant she was measuring how long she'd been working next to a problem she hadn't seen. The transfers hit at noon unless I can get into the authorization core and reset the credentials, which requires physical access to the server room at the office, Dante said. Yes. Which Roman controls? Yes. Options. Mira finally looked up from the screen. There's a secondary authorization terminal. It was installed during the original system build as a failsafe. Roman doesn't know about it because it predates him. She paused. It's in a location that's not on any organizational record. I installed it myself. Where? The Mercer Group's old data center, sublevel 3 of the Financial District Tower. She stopped. I know. The silence in the kitchen had a specific texture to it. Celine, who had been leaning against the counter, straightened slightly. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes moved to Dante's face. The building is in receivership, Mira continued. There's a sale process underway, but the infrastructure is still live. Utilities are maintained for the sale. The terminal should still be accessible. Dante looked at Celine. Celine looked back at him. I know where the sublevel access is, she said quietly. I grew up going to that building. A beat. I know the back entrance, the freight elevator, the maintenance codes, or at least I know what they were 5 years ago. The sale process won't have changed the maintenance infrastructure, Mira said. Those codes typically carry over until the sale closes. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Dante said, We go in, reset the credentials, lock Roman out of the financial system. That doesn't stop him from moving on the territories or the safe houses, but it cuts his operational funding and gives me something to negotiate with. It also, Mira said carefully, gives me time to push the secondary payment records to 3 specific destinations, people who have reason to care about an 8-year financial conspiracy. She glanced at Celine briefly, including people with interest in the Mercer Group's collapse. Celine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Do it, she said. It means the story becomes public, Mira said. I know what it means. Celine's voice was final. Dante stood. The movement cost him. He felt the wound protest in a way that was specific and informative about its current state. But he stood, and he stayed standing, and after a moment the pain receded to manageable. We move in an hour, he said. They moved in 40 minutes. The financial district tower was a 40-story glass structure that had been, 5 years ago, the flagship address of the Mercer Group's primary holdings. Now it stood in the gray morning with a for sale banner across the lobby facade and the particular emptiness of a building that had been recently stripped of its purpose. Celine walked them to the freight entrance on the building's east side without hesitation. Her face was closed, giving nothing away, but her movements were automatic. She'd walked this route many times. Her body remembered it even when the rest of her would rather not. She keyed the maintenance code, a 9-digit sequence she recited from memory without pausing, and the freight door released. Inside, the building smelled like old carpet and recycled air and the ghost of commercial occupancy. The freight elevator was still operational. They went to sub-level 3. The data center was dark except for the standby lights on equipment that was still running on automated maintenance cycles. Banks of servers stood in rows, silent, their indicator lights blinking in slow rhythms. Mira moved immediately to the back wall, to a panel that was bolted directly to the concrete and looked indistinguishable from the structural casing around it. She produced a key that she wore on a chain inside her shirt, opened the panel. The terminal behind it was basic, a keyboard and a small monitor, nothing sophisticated, built for function, not aesthetics. Mira sat on the floor in front of it and started working. Dante stood near the elevator. Celine stood near the server rows, her arms crossed, looking at the room with an expression he couldn't read. "You came here when you were a child," he said. Low, not a statement exactly. "My father had offices on 27. I used to come after school and do homework in the conference room." She didn't look at him. The people who worked here were good people. Most of them. When everything collapsed, a lot of them couldn't find work afterward. The name was toxic. A pause. 2 of them ended up at my clinic, not as patients, as volunteers. She turned slightly. Good people trying to hold on to something. He didn't say anything. "I used to think," she said, "that if I ever found out who was really responsible, not just my father's bad decisions, but whoever had architected it, I would feel something clarifying, like everything would finally make sense." She was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't feel like that." "What does it feel like?" "Expensive," she said. "Just very, very expensive." From the floor, Mira said, "I'm in." Her fingers were moving quickly over the keyboard. Credential reset in progress, 3 minutes. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, the lights went out. Not the standby equipment lights, all of them. The emergency strips didn't activate. The elevator indicator went dark. The entire sublevel dropped into a blackness that was absolute and immediate. Mira stopped typing. In the darkness, Dante heard the elevator activate. Someone was coming down. He moved toward Celine by sound, found her arm, pulled her toward the back of the server room, behind the last row. She went without resistance, which told him she understood the situation without needing it explained. "Mira," he could hear her, still at the terminal, the slight sound of her breathing. "Mira," he said very quietly. "Get away from the terminal." A pause. Then the sound of movement. The elevator reached sub-level 3. The doors opened. Flashlight beams. 2 of them, crossing. Footsteps. 2 sets, maybe 3, moving through the data center with the particular cadence of people who knew what they were looking for. Dante put his mouth close to Celine's ear. Did it finish? She didn't know. He didn't know. Mira was somewhere in the dark, and he couldn't ask her without giving position. The flashlights moved methodically through the server rows. Whoever it was, they were experienced. No rushing, no talking, just systematic coverage. One beam swung toward the back wall, toward the open panel, toward the terminal where the screen was still faintly lit. A voice said, "There." And then a second voice, closer than Dante expected, from somewhere to his left in the darkness, said something that froze every calculation in his head. The second voice was familiar. Not Roman. Not anyone from the operation. The second voice belonged to a man he hadn't heard speak in over a decade. A man he'd last seen at his father's funeral, hand on his shoulder, telling him that Marco Voss would have been proud. Conrad Voss said, "He's here, I can feel it. He always comes back to finish the job, just like his father." And in the darkness of the basement of the building he'd destroyed, surrounded by the servers of the empire he'd dismantled, Dante understood three things in rapid succession. Conrad was not a hostage. Conrad had never been a hostage. And Roman Vale had known exactly where Dante would go. Because Conrad had known. Because Conrad had spent 30 years knowing how the Voss men thought. Because he'd grown up with one and watched the other become. That was the first decision, to stay still in the dark while his uncle's voice echoed off concrete and server racks, to not react, to not breathe loud enough to locate himself. Every instinct in his body was firing at once, the adrenaline hitting his system like cold water, and he stood against the back wall of the server room and felt Celine's arm tense under his hand and made himself count to 3 before he did anything. 1. Conrad was moving. Dante could track him by sound, footsteps angling toward the terminal, toward the faint glow of the screen, which was either still processing or had already finished, and Dante didn't know which, and that single uncertainty was the axis everything else rotated around. 2. The 2 flashlight beams were at the middle of the room. Roman's men. Not Roman himself. Roman wouldn't come to a sublevel personally, not for retrieval work. He'd send people who were paid to be disposable. 3. Dante moved. He went left, away from Celine, staying behind the server row, moving on the balls of his feet across concrete he couldn't see. The wound in his side was a specific burning complaint that he filed and ignored. He needed to reach Mira, who was somewhere in the dark between him and the elevator, and he needed to reach her before the flashlight swept that direction. He found her by touch, her shoulder, her quick intake of breath when his hand landed. "Finished?" he breathed. A pause. Her lips near his ear. "Don't know. Screen went dark when the power cut." Conrad's voice again, clearer now, directed at the men with the flashlights. "Terminal access log. Check it. If the reset completed, we have a problem." One of the flashlights swung toward the back panel. Dante made a decision. He stepped out from behind the server row, directly into the path of the nearest flashlight. The beam hit him in the face. He heard someone pull in a sharp breath. In the half-second of mutual stillness that followed, he said, to the darkness beyond the light, to the place his uncle's voice had come from, "Conrad." The name landed. Footsteps stopped. "Dante." Conrad's voice had changed. The memory of it, the version from the funeral, had been warm, paternal. This version was something else, careful, something that had weight in it he hadn't bothered to hide. "Put the light down," he said to the man holding it. The beam dropped. The sublevel returned to the fractured half-dark of standby equipment lights. Conrad Voss was 63 years old and looked like a retired version of Marco, which was the first thing Dante noticed and the thing he wished he hadn't. Same jaw, same height, the same way of holding himself upright that Marco had always had. But where Marco's stillness had been the stillness of a man at rest, Conrad's was the stillness of a man who had practiced being unreadable. He was standing 10 feet away. He had no weapon visible. The 2 men with flashlights were behind and flanking. Dante clocked them without looking directly, the way you develop peripheral awareness when your life occasionally depends on it. "You're not a hostage," Dante said. "No. Roman doesn't have you. You're here because he called you." "I've been working with Roman for some time." Conrad said it without inflection. "I imagine Mira found the payment records. 8 years. 8 years. He looked at Dante steadily. "Your father and I had a disagreement that had been building for a long time. The business, the inheritance, It doesn't matter what the specifics were. It came to a point. You had him killed. I made a decision. Roman was already operational in your father's orbit. Not for me initially. He had other interests there. We found common ground." Conrad's hands were at his sides, relaxed. "I want you to understand I didn't do it lightly. I don't care how lightly you did it. I think you do. I think you need to understand that it wasn't. He was my father." The words came out of Dante's chest with a force that surprised him. Not shouted. Worse than shouted. The volume of something that has been held under pressure for a very long time in a very small space. "He was my father, and you sat at his funeral with your hand on my shoulder and told me he would have been proud of me." Conrad was quiet for a moment. "He would have been. Get out of my way." "Dante." Get out of my way or I will go through you. One of the men behind Conrad shifted. Dante heard it. The small sound of weight redistributing, someone preparing to move. His body responded before the thought fully formed. He was already turning, already adjusting the geometry of the space, putting himself at an angle that complicated what the man behind him was planning. Conrad said, "Don't." The man stopped. Conrad and Dante looked at each other across 10 feet of server-lit darkness. "The terminal," Conrad said. "Did it finish?" "I don't know." "If it finished, Roman loses the financial system. He'll accelerate the territorial moves, and he'll go physical instead of financial." Conrad's voice was still level. "More people get hurt. That's his choice. You could still walk away from this, Dante. Leave the city. I'll arrange." "Walk away." The two words came out flat and cold. "From what you did to my father, from what I did to the Mercers, because you pointed me at them. Walk away. The Mercer situation was your decision. Made on a lie you constructed." His voice had dropped, but it hadn't softened. "Every choice I made for 7 years was built on what you and Roman put in front of me. The file, the evidence, the story about Gideon, all of it went through Roman, and Roman went through you." He took one step forward. "You didn't just kill my father. You turned me into the instrument of someone else's agenda for 7 years and didn't have the spine to even tell me yourself." Something moved across Conrad's face. Not guilt, something more complicated than guilt. Something that might have been, briefly, the acknowledgement that there was a version of this he hadn't fully calculated. "Celine Mercer," Dante said. "She's in this building." Conrad's eyes moved involuntarily to the server rows. Confirmation. "She lost everything," Dante said. "Her career, her family's money, her father's health. He's in a facility now because the stress of the collapse." He stopped himself. "She lost everything because I destroyed it. Because you and Roman handed me a direction and I followed it without asking enough questions. You were grieving. Don't." The word was a wall. "Don't use that. You don't get to use that." The sublevel was silent, except for the hum of server equipment. Then, from somewhere behind the left server row, Celine stepped out. She walked into the space between Dante and Conrad without hurrying, without drama, and stopped at Dante's left shoulder. She looked at Conrad Voss with an expression that had nothing theatrical in it, just a clear, level assessment of a person she was seeing properly for the first time. "You destroyed my father's life," she said, "to cover what you did to his." Conrad looked at her. For the first time, something in his composure fractured slightly. A change around his eyes, the specific discomfort of a man being seen by someone who has nothing to lose in the scene. "I understand I don't need you to understand anything about me," she said. "I need you to understand that it's over. Whatever you and Roman built, it's over. And the question for you right now is whether you help fix it or whether you become the last thing standing between Dante and Roman." A pause. "Because if you're the last thing standing," she said, "I don't think that ends well for you." Conrad looked from her to Dante and back. His phone rang. He looked at the screen, held it up so Dante could see the name. Roman. "Answer it," Dante said. "On speaker." A beat. Then Conrad answered. Put it on speaker. Held it between them. Roman's voice filled the sublevel. "Terminal reset completed 40 seconds before the power cut. Dove got there too late." A pause. "Is he there?" Conrad said nothing. "Conrad." Roman's voice was still reasonable, still that measured warmth. "Is Dante there?" "Yes," Conrad said. "Okay." Roman absorbed this. "Here's where we are. The financial system reset buys him approximately 6 hours before I rode around it. The territorial moves are already in progress. 3 of the East Side crews formally transferred in the last hour. The docks are mine. The councilman has been reminded of his new affiliations." A breath. "But I'm willing to simplify this. 1 meeting, neutral ground. Dante comes alone." Dante said, "Where?" A pause. Roman hadn't expected him on the line. "The Harbor Crane facility, North Dock, 2 hours." "Why there?" "Because it's mine now, and I want you to see it." A beat. "Come alone. Bring the woman and I'll know you're not interested in resolution. The call ended. Conrad lowered the phone. Dante looked at the two men with flashlights, looked at Conrad, made a calculation that was cold and quick and based entirely on what was useful. You're going to walk out of this building, he said to Conrad. You're going to go wherever you plan to go after this. And then you're going to wait, because when this is over, I'm going to find you. He let that sit. Not tonight, not this week, but I'm going to find you, and you're going to sit in front of Celine's father, and you're going to tell him everything, every piece of it, on record. Conrad's jaw tightened. And if I don't, then everything Mira just sent to 3 destinations also goes to 2 more, including the DA's office. Dante held his gaze. You spent 30 years making plans. Plan for this. Conrad looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned, and walked to the elevator with his 2 men, and the doors closed, and they were gone. The sublevel breathed. Mira came out from behind the server row. Her face was the color of old paper. The reset completed, she said. The secondary pushes went out. 3 recipients. Good. Dante turned to Celine. You heard Roman? I heard him. Her voice was steady. You're not going alone. He said, I heard what he said. She looked at him directly. Roman has been managing your decisions for 6 years. Don't let him manage this one. He stared at her. The wound in his side was burning steadily, the specific heat of damaged tissue being asked to continue operating. His hands were steady, but his shoulders weren't, a deep muscle exhaustion from the adrenaline cycling through and back. He was running on the last clean inch of a very short reserve. I can't protect you there, he said. I'm not asking you to protect me. She held his gaze. I'm asking you to let me stand next to you when this ends. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Mira, he said, without breaking eye contact with Celine. Call everyone you can still reach, anyone who hasn't flipped. I don't need soldiers. I need witnesses. People who can stand outside the North Dock crane facility in 2 hours and make it impossible for Roman to make this disappear quietly. How many? However many you can get. Mira was already on her phone. Dante turned back to Celine. If it goes wrong, then it goes wrong, she said. I've already survived one thing that was supposed to break me. My risk assessment is different than yours. He held her gaze for a moment. He thought about saying something. There were several things that were true and that he had never said to anyone, and that were pressing against the inside of his chest with increasing force. He filed them. 2 hours. Let's go, he said. The North Dock crane facility sat at the end of a pier that jutted into Blackridge Harbor like a broken finger. 4 massive loading cranes stood against the storm sky, their arms angled out over the water, the whole structure lit by industrial floods that turned everything a flat, bluish white. The harbor behind them was black and choppy, the remnants of the 3-day rain pushing the water into short, hard waves that slapped against the pier pilings. Dante came through the facility gate alone. Celine was 30 yards behind him, in the shadows of a container stack with Mira and 6 other people. Not soldiers exactly, but people who had worked the financial and logistical side of Dante's operation and who had been called by Mira in the last 90 minutes, and who had come, which told him something about what they thought of Roman's takeover. He walked down the center of the pier. Roman was waiting at the base of the largest crane. He looked exactly like himself. That was the thing about Roman Vale. He never looked like anything other than exactly what he presented himself as. Composed, well-dressed, the kind of man whose equilibrium the universe seemed to respect. He had 2 men on either side of him, both large, both standing with the particular stillness of professionals. He looked at Dante's side, at the way Dante was moving, and something that was almost sympathy crossed his face. You should be in a hospital, he said. You should be in a cell, Dante said. We're both in the wrong place. Roman almost smiled. Conrad? Gone. He's predictable in his self-preservation. It's actually one of the things I've always relied on. He tilted his head. He told you everything. The payment records told me. Conrad just confirmed the architectures. And now you're here. Roman spread his hands slightly. Not a gesture of surrender, more like an expansion of the conversation's frame. What did you expect to accomplish? The empire is transferred. The accounts are locked, reset or not. I have resources you can't touch. The crews are mine. He paused. You came to the meeting without a plan because you didn't have one. You came because you needed to be here, to see my face, to give you the chance to stop, Dante said. Roman blinked. I'm sorry? Walk away from the city. Give back what you can still give back. Let the people whose territories you absorbed return to independent operation. Dante's voice was flat, no anger in it, which was more unsettling than anger would have been. There's a path where this ends without you in the ground. Roman looked at him for a moment, then he laughed. A short, genuine sound, not performed, which was almost worse than if it had been. You came to the meeting to offer me an exit? I came to the meeting to give you the choice. Dante, Roman's voice was almost affectionate. You have nothing. You have a hole in your side and a financial system reset that I'll route around by morning, and 6 or 7 people who followed you here out of, what, loyalty? Sentiment? He shook his head. I have the city. I've had the city for 3 years. I've just been waiting until the conditions were right to hold it openly. Tonight those conditions exist. He studied Dante's face. What I don't understand is why you're not angry. You should be furious. You should be screaming. I was angry for 7 years, Dante said. I'm done with it. At the wrong person. At everyone wrong. He held Roman's gaze. You built this on my father's death. You used his son to clear the board for you, and along the way you let me destroy a family that had nothing to do with any of it. He paused. I'm not screaming because screaming doesn't fix any of that. What fixes it is ending you. Roman was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Get him. The 2 men moved. Dante was already moving. Not back, forward, inside the angle of the first man's reach, taking the grab on his jacket instead of his throat, using the momentum to turn, which cost him the wound and he felt it tear, a bright specific agony that he pushed through because stopping was the only thing he couldn't afford. He got one elbow into the first man's face, the crack of cartilage, a sound he knew, and the man went sideways but didn't go down. The second man caught him across the back. Dante hit the concrete pier on one knee, both hands down, and breathed through the impact. The wound was screaming now. His left side was wet, and he knew without checking that the dressing had failed. He got up anyway. Getting up was the only available option. Roman watched from 20 feet away with his hands in his pockets. The first man came back in. Dante took the hit to the ribs rather than his side, angling it, trading pain for position, got inside, drove the man back against the base of the crane with enough force that something in the man's shoulder gave way, and he made a sound and stopped. The second man hesitated. Dante straightened. He was breathing hard, and the breath had a wet edge to it that worried him in a distant, clinical way. His hands were shaking. He looked at Roman across the pier. Walk away, Dante said again. Last time. Roman pulled out his own gun. He pointed it at Dante's chest with the steady hand of someone who had pointed guns at people before and found the experience unremarkable. No, he said simply. A sound behind him. Roman turned. Celine Mercer stood at the edge of the crane's floodlight, and she was holding her phone, and the phone was connected to something that Dante hadn't known about, and Roman hadn't known about, and that Mira had arranged in the last 40 minutes with the contacts she'd spent 20 years building. A direct live feed to 2 investigative journalists and a deputy district attorney who owed Mira a professional favor and who is currently watching everything on a screen in his office across the city. Your face has been live for 11 minutes, Celine said. Everything you said. The confirmation about Dante's father, the financial arrangements. She held the phone steady. Her hand was not shaking. Everything. Roman stared at her. His gun was still pointed at Dante. His face had finally, for the first time in 6 years, lost its quality of settled calm. 11 minutes, he said. The feed started when you said the empire was transferred, she said. We needed you talking. Roman's grip on the gun tightened. His eyes moved between Celine and Dante with the rapid calculation of a man running probability assessments in real time, and what he was calculating, Dante understood, was whether the damage could be contained, and the answer he was arriving at, visibly, was no. and men who arrived at that answer with a gun in their hand were in the most dangerous moment of their lives. Roman, Dante's voice was completely even. It's over. The gun stayed level. Shooting me on a live feed doesn't help you, Dante said. It makes everything worse. The harbor wind came off the water and the crane above them groaned in it, a deep metallic complaint from 40 tons of steel being moved by weather. The floodlights threw hard shadows across the pier. Roman Vale stood in the middle of it with the gun in his hand and 6 years of architecture collapsing around him, and his face doing something not at Dante. The shot went wide, deliberately, or from a hand that had finally lost its steadiness, Dante couldn't tell, and hit the base of the crane with a sound like a struck bell, metal on metal, and in the half second that followed, everything on the pier moved at once. Dante went left. His body made the decision before his mind caught up, muscle and instinct carrying him behind the crane's anchor housing, a concrete block the size of a car that absorbed the next shot cleanly. He heard Celine go down, not shot, he registered immediately. The sound was wrong for that. It was the sound of someone dropping to the pier surface deliberately, taking cover. He heard shouting from the direction of the container stacks, Mira's people, moving. Roman ran. Not toward any of them. Away. Toward the crane's service ladder, the one that ran up the outside of the main mast to the operator's cab 60 feet above the pier. Dante watched him go. Watched him grab the ladder and start climbing with the specific desperation of a man who had run out of horizontal options. He understood it immediately and hated that he understood it. 60 feet in the air, Roman had options. Hostage potential if he could reach someone, time to negotiate, the psychological leverage of height and inaccessibility. It was tactically coherent, and it was exactly what Dante would have done. He went to the ladder. Celine was on her feet. Dante. Stay down. Your side. He was already climbing. The ladder was cold and wet from the harbor wind, and his hands found the rungs by grip alone, not by feel, because what he was feeling in his hands was increasingly limited to pressure and the knowledge that letting go was not acceptable. The wound in his side had moved beyond pain into something more ambient, a whole-body heat, a systemic complaint that he heard the way you hear background noise in a building you've lived in long enough. Present, noted, filed. Below him the pier receded. Above him Roman climbed, 15 rungs ahead, his breathing audible, ragged, driven, a man who kept himself fit, but not for this, not for 60 feet of cold steel ladder in harbor wind with everything collapsing beneath him. At 30 feet, Dante's left hand slipped. He caught himself on the right arm alone, his shoulder taking the full load, and for one suspended second he was hanging off the side of a crane 60 feet above a concrete pier with a bullet wound and a failed dressing and the harbor wind trying to peel him off the metal, and he thought, with crystalline clarity, "This is the most expensive thing I have ever done." He got the left hand back. Climbed. Roman reached the operator's cab, a small enclosed platform at the top of the crane's mast, glass on 3 sides, open to the harbor on the 4th. He pulled himself in and turned. Dante came over the top of the ladder 30 seconds later. He got onto the platform and straightened and stood there and breathed. Just breathed. 4 breaths, counted, while his body took stock of what it had just been asked to do. The harbor was 60 feet below. Black water, choppy, the lights of Black Ridge City smearing across its surface in broken streaks. The wind up here was different from the wind on the pier. It had direction and weight. Roman was pressed against the far side of the cab. He still had the gun. His hair was disarranged for the first time in the 6 years Dante had known him, and there was something almost disorienting about that. The small, humanizing detail of it, the way it made him look like a person instead of a function. The gun was pointing at Dante's chest. His hand was steadier than it had been on the pier. "You can't climb back down with me shooting at you," Roman said. "You're right." So, he kept the gun level. "This resolves here." Dante looked at him. Really looked. The way you look at something you've lived alongside for 6 years and are only now seeing clearly. The precise competence of him. The patience. The way every quality he'd valued in Roman, every reason he'd trusted him, was real. Those qualities existed. They were genuine. They'd just been in service of something that had nothing to do with what Dante believed he was building. You could have just built your own thing, Dante said. Roman blinked. You had the skills, the patience, the intelligence, the operational capability. Dante kept his voice even. The wind moved across the open side of the cab. You didn't need my father dead. You didn't need to spend 8 years maneuvering me. You could have built something from scratch. From scratch, Roman repeated. Yes. Do you know how long from scratch takes? Something moved in his voice. Not the calculation that was usually there, but something older. Your father had 40 years of infrastructure. When I came to Blackridge, I had nothing. No connections, no capital, no name. He held the gun level, but his eyes were doing something complex. Conrad offered me a shortcut, and then you came along, 17 years old, grieving, furious, talented, and you were a better shortcut. That's all I was. That's not... Roman stopped. Reset. You were genuinely good at this. I want you to know that. The way you built the operation, the efficiency of the Mercer takedown, the territorial consolidation, that was real. That was yours. Built on a foundation you laid. Most foundations are laid by someone else. That's not an excuse, it's just true. Dante looked at the gun, at Roman's face behind it, at the harbor 60 feet below and the city beyond it, all its light smearing in the wet air, and somewhere in those lights, a clinic 3 blocks from an industrial waterfront where Celine Mercer had rebuilt her life from the rubble of what Dante had made of it. There's a deputy DA watching a live feed, Dante said. There are 2 journalists with everything Mira sent. Conrad's payment records, the file on my father, the organizational transfers. He paused. It's over, Roman. The question is whether you fall off this crane or whether you walk down the ladder. If I walk down the ladder, I spend the rest of my life in a cell. Yes. And that's the option you're offering. That's the option that exists. Roman's jaw tightened. For a moment, something shifted behind his eyes. An assessment, rapid and cold. The last functioning calculation of a very capable mind evaluating the remaining variables. Dante watched it happen. He knew what Roman was weighing. He knew because he understood how Roman thought, had understood it for 6 years, which was the specific and terrible intimacy of having trusted someone completely. I'm not going to shoot you, Roman said. Something in Dante's chest loosened by a fraction. Not because of the feed, Roman continued. Because it wouldn't... He stopped. The gun lowered 3 inches, then 6, then came down to his side. He looked at Dante with an expression that was the most unguarded thing Dante had ever seen on his face. Because it wouldn't actually accomplish anything. That's all. I know, Dante said. Roman sat down on the floor of the operator's cab with his back against the glass. The gun rested beside his hand, not pointed at anything. He looked suddenly very tired. Not the way people look tired at the end of a long day, but the way they look tired at the end of something much longer than a day. Something that has been running for years and has finally stopped. Your father, Roman said. For what it's worth. It was quick. He didn't suffer. Dante said nothing. He stood with the wind and the harbor and the city and let the words exist without responding to them, because there was no response that fit, and silence was the only thing with the right dimensions. After a moment, he reached down and picked up the gun. He put it in his jacket. Come down, he said. Roman came down. The deputy DA's name was Kehoe, and he arrived at the pier 40 minutes later with 4 officers and the particular expression of a man who has been watching something remarkable on a screen and is still adjusting to the fact that it was real. He took Roman Vale into custody without theater. Roman went without resistance, which was its own kind of statement. The last legible gesture of a man who had always known, somewhere in his operating architecture, that patience eventually ran out. Dante watched from the base of the crane. Celine was beside him. She had her hand at his back, not holding him up, just present, the same way she'd been present at Feher's building when she didn't have to be. He was aware of it without making anything of it. Kehoe came to him after Roman was in the car. I'm going to need a statement, he said. He was a compact man in his 50s with the eyes of someone who had learned to read rooms quickly. Tomorrow, at the office, with your attorney. I'll be there. Kehoe looked at him for a moment. The financial records Mira Santos sent, the payment trail, the original file on your father's death, that's going to open a significant investigation. Your organization is going to be part of that. I know. Means a lot of what you built gets examined. I know that too. Kehoe studied his face. You understand what that means for you personally? Yes. Dante held his gaze. I understand exactly what that means. A pause. Kehoe nodded slowly and went back to his people. Mira materialized at Dante's left. She looked exhausted and precise, which was her natural state amplified. The secondary financial pushes went to all 5 recipients, she said quietly. The East Side cruiser that transferred tonight, 3 of the 4 crew leaders have already called me. They want to talk about returning to independent operation. Let them. Don't negotiate terms tonight. Just let them know the door is open. And the accounts? Unfreeze what's unfrozen. What Roman took before the reset, let it go. It's not worth the fight. Mira absorbed that. She started to say something, stopped, then said it anyway. You built something real, Dante. Whatever the foundation was, the operation, the infrastructure, it was real. I know, he said. That's part of what makes it complicated. She nodded and moved away. The pier was quieting. Officers were processing the scene. The 2 men Roman had brought were in cuffs near the facility gate, being interviewed by a woman with a recording device. The harbor kept its own indifferent rhythm, water against pilings, the sound that the city made at its edges. Celine said, You need to go back to Feher. Yes? The dressing is completely failed. I know. You've been walking around with a reopened gunshot wound for... I know, Celine. She stopped, looked at him. In the floodlights, her face was sharply defined. The exhaustion in it, and beneath the exhaustion, something that wasn't relief exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. Can you walk to the car? Yes. Without leaning on anything? A pause. Probably. She took his arm anyway. Not the way you take someone's arm when they're failing, the way you take an arm when you're walking somewhere together and it's a reasonable thing to do. He didn't comment on it. They walked to the car. Feher worked on the wound for an hour and said things in 3 languages that Dante chose not to translate. When he was done, he said Dante needed a week of actual stillness and looked at Celine as he said it, clearly identifying her as the enforcement mechanism. She told Feher she'd do her best and clearly meant it as a threat rather than a reassurance, which Feher seemed to appreciate. They went back to her apartment. It was 4 a.m. The city outside the windows was doing what cities did at 4 a.m, maintaining itself at low volume, the skeleton crews of the night shift keeping the infrastructure running while the rest of it slept. The harbor was visible from the living room window, the lights of the far shore making a broken line across the dark water. Dante sat on the couch with his jacket off and his side properly dressed and his hands on his knees and looked at nothing in particular. Celine came out of the kitchen with water and set it on the coffee table and sat in the chair across from him. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze she'd had since the abandoned factory, which felt like a long time ago now and was, technically, only about 20 hours. Your uncle, she said. I'll find him. Kehoe's people will find him first. Probably, he considered. That's probably better. Because if you find him first... Because if I find him first, I don't know what I do. He said it flatly, without drama. And I'd rather know before I'm in the room with him. She accepted that. She was good at accepting honest answers without requiring them to be cleaner than they were. My father, she said. You said Conrad would sit in front of him and tell him everything. Yes. He's not always lucid. Some days he doesn't know what year it is. She paused. But some days he does. Some days he's completely present. She looked at the window. I want him to have a day where he knows, where someone tells him the truth of what happened to his name. A beat. Not for absolution, just so he knows. I'll make sure of it, Dante said. You can't make sure of it. You're about to spend a significant amount of time talking to lawyers and investigators, and I'll make sure of it, he said again. That's not negotiable. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but changing quality. The way light changes quality in the last hour before dawn without you being able to identify the exact moment it happened. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "After the lawyers." He'd been thinking about this on the pier and in the car and on Fahir's table, not with the part of his mind that planned operations and assessed variables, but with a quieter part that he hadn't used much in the last 7 years. "I have money that isn't Roman's," he said. "Not a lot, relative to what the organization was worth, but enough. There are assets that were personally mine, not organizational." He paused. "I'm going to spend some of it on the legal process, whatever that costs. And I'm going to spend some of it on what I broke." She was quiet. "The Mercer Group employees, the ones who couldn't find work after. The ones who ended up—" He stopped. "You said 2 of them volunteer at your clinic." "Yes." "Are there others?" She looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because I want to know how many there are and what they need." He held her gaze. "Not as an apology. I know that money doesn't— I know it doesn't fix the shape of what happened, but people's lives have material dimensions, and I damage the material dimensions of a lot of lives, and I have material resources." He paused. "It's not enough. I know it's not enough, but it's something I can actually do." Celine was very still for a moment. "There are 11 that I know of," she said quietly, "former Mercer Group employees who ended up in serious difficulty after the collapse. Some of them are okay now. Some aren't." She paused. "There are also 2 ongoing lawsuits against the estate, former partners who lost money in the collapse and never received any accounting. I want the names. All of them. Dante, I know it doesn't clear the ledger. I'm not trying to clear the ledger." He leaned forward slightly, which pulled against the dressing, which he ignored. 7 years ago, someone handed me a story and I used it to do a lot of damage. And some of that damage is permanent, and I have to live with that. But the parts that aren't permanent, I want to work on those. That's all. That's what I have." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt the weight of it, which was significant. "Okay," she said finally. "Just that." He sat back. The exhaustion of the last 24 hours was sitting on his chest like something physical, and he let it, because there was nothing left that required fighting it off. The wound ached. The harbor was outside the window. Somewhere in the city, Roman Vale was in a holding facility, and Conrad Voss was in whatever place he'd gone to ground, and Mira was probably still at a laptop somewhere, and the 3-day rain had finally, somewhere in the last hour, stopped. He noticed the photograph on the kitchen wall for the first time. It was a small print, simply framed. A younger version of Celine and a man in his 60s with her same jaw, standing on a dock somewhere, squinting into sunlight. Gideon Mercer, before the collapse. He looked like a man who was proud of his daughter. He looked like a man who had no idea what was coming. Dante looked at the photograph for a moment and then looked away. "Get some sleep," Celine said. She was watching him with the expression she got when she was being a clinician. Not cold, but professional, the caring that keeps its hands off the sentiment. Actual sleep. Not lying on my couch running probability assessments. "How do you know that's what I do?" "Because it's what you were doing the first night, and you had the same look then that you have now." She stood. "The crisis is over. Your brain hasn't registered that yet, but it will." She moved toward the hallway. "Sleep." He watched her go. At the hallway entrance, she stopped, not the same way she'd stopped the night before, when the words had been about anger and explanation and the enormous weight of everything she'd been carrying. This was different. She just paused with her hand on the wall and looked back at him. "For what it's worth," she said, "what you did tonight. On the pier, on the crane." She paused. "That wasn't just about Roman." He waited. "You could have let the DA handle it. You could have stayed at the container stacks and let it resolve without—" She stopped. "You went up there because you needed to give him the choice. Even him." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know what to do with that. I'm not ready to do anything with it, but I wanted you to know I noticed." He didn't say anything. She went to bed. He lay back on the couch and looked at the ceiling and listened to the city outside the window and felt the wound and the exhaustion, and underneath both of those things, something else, quieter, Not comfortable exactly, but not uncomfortable either. Something that didn't have a name he'd been in the habit of using. He fell asleep before he could identify it. Boom. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind. Not dramatic, not acute, just the sustained, difficult work of consequence. Dante gave his statement to Kehoe over 3 sessions, each one longer than the one before, each one requiring him to describe in flat, specific language the shape of what he had built and what it had cost. His attorney sat beside him and occasionally put a hand on the table in the way attorneys do when they want their client to stop talking. And Dante talked anyway, because the calculation he'd made was that partial cooperation was the same as no cooperation, and no cooperation was the thing that looked like the old version of himself, and he was done with the old version. Roman Vale was charged on 11 counts. The trial would take years. Conrad Voss was found in a rented house 40 miles outside Blackridge and was charged separately, accessory to murder, conspiracy, financial fraud. He didn't resist arrest. Dante watched the news report about it in Feher's waiting room during a follow-up appointment and felt something that was not satisfaction and not grief and was maybe just the specific exhaustion of a thing being over. The East Side Cruise returned to independent operation. The councilman, freed from his Roman-era obligations, made a public statement that was carefully worded and legally safe and said nothing directly but indicated which way the wind was blowing. The dock operations were absorbed by a legitimate freight company that had been waiting 18 months for the criminal element to clear before moving in. Dante had made the call personally, giving them the opportunity, which was the closest thing to a clean ending that situation allowed. Mira took a position with a financial compliance firm. She called Dante the day she signed the contract and said, "This is the most boring thing I have ever agreed to do, and I'm more relieved than I've ever been." He told her she'd made a good decision. She said she knew. He found 11 names. He spent 3 weeks going through the list that Celine gave him with a legal team that he paid to find legitimate channels, back wages that had been improperly handled, severance arrangements that had never been completed because the company had collapsed before they could be processed, 2 partnership disputes that were settled out of what remained of his personal capital. It was not a comprehensive repair. Celine had been right that there was no comprehensive repair, but it was something a person could actually do, which was the only category of action that interested him anymore. The 2 former Mercer employees who volunteered at Celine's clinic came to him separately, not together, in the same week. He didn't know she'd told them anything or suggested they come. One of them was a woman in her 40s who had run the Mercer Group's procurement division and who now helped with supply management at the clinic on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She sat across from him in a coffee shop and said, "I want you to know I'm not going to forgive you. I just want to understand what happened." He told her. The whole thing. Conrad, Roman, the engineered evidence, the 7 years. She listened without speaking, and at the end she said, "Thank you for telling me the truth," and left her coffee half-finished and walked out. He sat in the coffee shop for a while afterward. The second man was easier and then harder, in different ways, for different reasons. Dante left both meetings feeling exactly as he deserved to feel, which was the closest to honest he'd been in a long time. Gideon Mercer had a good day on a Thursday in October. Celine called Dante that morning and said simply, "He knows who I am. He's been asking about the estate." Her voice was careful, holding something. Today might be the day. Conrad had given his formal deposition 3 weeks earlier. Dante had arranged, through Kehoe and through his own attorney, for a copy to be prepared in plain language. Not legal language, not the language of charges and counts, but a straightforward account of what had happened to the Mercer Group and why. Celine read it to her father in the care facility's garden in the afternoon. Dante wasn't there for that. It wasn't his moment to be there for. She called him that night. He understood, she said. Her voice was different, stripped down to something more essential, the precision she usually maintained smoothed away by something that had needed to come out. He was angry. He cried. He asked me 3 times if I was sure. A pause. Then he said, I knew it wasn't right. I knew I hadn't done anything that terrible. He'd been carrying that for 5 years, not knowing why it happened, thinking maybe he'd done something. She stopped. He thought maybe he deserved it. Dante sat with that. "Thank you," she said. For making sure. I told you I would. I know. People say things. A pause. You did it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Outside his window, a different window, a smaller apartment, the penthouse was part of what the legal process had reorganized. The harbor was still visible, the same harbor from a different angle, the same water. How is he now? He asked. Asleep. He was tired after. A pause. Good tired, I think. The kind you get when something you've been holding gets put down. She was quiet. I know that kind of tired. Yeah, he said. I'm starting to. On a morning in November that was cold and clear after a week of cloud, Celine met him at the waterfront. Not the pier, not the crane facility, not any of the places that had maps of the last months on them. A different stretch of the harbor, further south, where the industrial infrastructure gave way to a strip of weathered concrete that people walked in the mornings because the light on the water was particular and good. They'd been doing this for 3 weeks. Meeting, walking, sometimes talking and sometimes not. The shape of it was still forming, too early for definitions, too established already for either of them to pretend it was nothing. They existed in that space with the specific carefulness of two people who had both been badly burned and who understood that carefulness wasn't the same as avoidance. The morning light was low and gold, the harbor catching it in long broken lines across the chop. A cargo ship was moving out toward the open water, slow and enormous the way they always were, its horn making a sound that crossed the whole harbor. Celine walked with her hands in her jacket pockets and her face turned slightly toward the water. She'd cut her hair shorter in the last month. He didn't know why he noticed that. He just did. My father remembered something yesterday, she said, from when I was about 8. He told me this story about taking me to see the harbor for the first time, and I apparently cried because I thought the ships were too big and I was afraid they'd fall over. She smiled, a real one, the kind that reached places you didn't usually see. I have no memory of this. He thought it was the funniest thing. Were you always afraid of things that were too big? She considered this. For a while I was afraid of things that were too small, things I couldn't see coming. She glanced at him. I think I've recalibrated. He looked at the water. I've been thinking, he said, about what comes next. He said it carefully because the word next had been complicated for a long time. There's a property on the south end of the waterfront district. Commercial space, ground floor, been empty for 2 years. The neighborhood it's the same kind of neighborhood as yours. Same needs. She looked at him. I'm not a doctor, he said. I know that. I'm not suggesting... He stopped, started again. There's more than one way a space can be useful. Administrative support, operational capacity, funding structures. A pause. I have skills that don't require anyone to get hurt. Celine was quiet for a moment. The harbor moved. The cargo ship was further out now, becoming smaller against the water. You'd want to be involved, she said, if that's acceptable. With the clinic. With whatever you think the neighborhood needs. You know it better than I do. He paused. You've always known it better than I do. She walked for a few steps without saying anything. He let her. I'm going to need to think about it, she said. I know. I'm not saying no. I know that too. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They stood at the edge of the concrete with the harbor in front of them and the city behind them, and the November light making everything clean and a little cold and precise. She turned and looked at him with the direct gaze she'd had since the factory, the one that didn't give him anything he hadn't earned, that saw him exactly as clearly as he was. Not the man he'd been, not some improved version she'd decided to project onto him, just what he actually was, standing in the morning light with his history and his consequences and his intention to do something better with whatever came next. You're not the same person who found me in that factory, she said. No. I'm not the same person either. No, he agreed. She looked at the harbor for a moment. Then she looked back at him. Ask me again in a month, she said, about the space. Okay. And Dante. She said his name the way people say a name when they want it to land with full weight. The next thing you build it like you mean it to last, not like something you're prepared to burn down. He looked at her, at the harbor, at the light on the water and the city rising behind them and the long, ordinary morning stretching out ahead. "Yeah," he said, "that's the plan." They stood there for a while, not saying anything, not needing to. The harbor moved the way it always had, indifferent and enormous and carrying everything forward, whether you were ready or not. The war was over. The ghosts were still there. They didn't go away. That wasn't how it worked. But they were behind him now instead of in front, which was the only arrangement that made the next step possible. He took the next step. So did she.